you. I think yes, we are back. Excellent. Welcome in, everyone. Once again, it's another edition of White Fang by Jack London, as read by me, yours truly, Vexing Cat. So I just wanted to say hello to you lovely listeners that are here early. Thank you so much. I am, I was checking out a new thing. Actually, Tiger Faye, if you're still here and lurking, I wanted to show you what the API scraping website does. It's kind of neat. So if you go into if you go into the in infinity, if you go into this embed interactive website, you can actually embed your live stream a link into a Twitter post, which I think I'm going to start doing. I was testing it, but I hadn't seen what it looks like, and I think it's pretty cool. You can actually follow and subscribe directly from Twitter to your live Twitch, which I think is pretty slick. Anyway, I'll close out of that. There we go. All right, everyone on board for choo choo. We're gonna continue. I believe we're in part 3, chapter 4. So right now we know that White Fang, as just a quick synopsis of what's already happened, we know that the she-wolf, Quiche, the mother of White Fang, was traded away by Grey Beaver, the Native American that was the brother of her original owner. He traded her away, and White Fang he kept. Now, White Fang, without his mother there to protect him, is now completely at the mercy of Lip Lip, who is wholly camp dog, no wolf. So he sees White Fang as an outsider because White Fang is 75% wild wolf and only 25% dog. And he has gotten all of the other younger dogs to bully him and to chase him and to run as a pack against him. Now, White Fang has learned to be alone, has learned to make it miserable for any dog to be outside of that pack dynamic. If they're all going to bully him, if they're alone, he's going to take them out. And he has, like, rid several families of their dogs that, were strayed too far from camp alone. So he is stealthy. He is faster than any other dog in camp. He is what his environment has made him. More stealthy, more violent, more quick to anger, and react with violence, unfortunately. So, as we can continue this story, let me wind this up open a little bit. There we go. As we continue this story, I just want you all to remember this is a book written 120 some odd years ago. Actually, this would have been 118 years ago if it was written in 1906. So if you have any questions, wait between chapters. Once again, we're at the beginning. Hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, do whatever it is that you need to do to become comfortable and enjoy the story. I have a coffee. My first coffee of the day. I considered drinking some earlier, but I opted to play Dave the Diver instead, which, if you have not played, I highly recommend. It's very cute. So let's get started, shall we? There we go. Chapter 4 of White Fang by Jack London, The Trail of the Gods. Oh my goodness. Gara, right as I get started reading, that's when you're like, ha! I'm just gonna give away free subs. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Yes. Chapter 4, The Trail of the Gods. In the fall of the year, when the days were shortening and the bite of the frost was coming into the air, White Fang got his chance for liberty. Ooh. For several days there had been a great hubbub in the village. The summer camp was being dismantled, and the tribe, bag and baggage, was preparing to go off to the fall hunting. White Fang watched it all with eager eyes, and when the teepees began to come down and the canoes were loading at the bank, he understood. Already the canoes were departing, and some had disappeared down the river. Quite deliberately, he determined to stay behind. He waited his opportunity to slink out of camp to the woods. Here, in the running stream where ice was beginning to form, he hid his trail. Then he crawled into the heart of a dense thicket and waited. The time passed by, and he slept intermittently for hours. Then he was aroused by Gray Beaver's voice calling him by name. There were other voices. White Fang could hear Gray Beaver's squaw taking part in the search, and Mitsa, who was Gray Beaver's son. White Fang trembled with fear, and though the impulse came to crawl out of his hiding place, he resisted it. After a time, the voices died away, and some time after that, he crept out to enjoy the success of his undertaking. Darkness was coming on, and for a while he played about among the trees, pleasuring in his freedom. Then, and quite suddenly, he became aware of loneliness. He sat down to consider, listening to the silence of the forest and perturbed by it. That nothing moved nor sounded seemed ominous. He felt the lurking of danger unseen and unguessed. He was suspicious of the looming bulks of the trees, of the dark shadows that might conceal all manner of perilous things. Then it was cold. Here was no warm side of a teepee against which to snuggle. The frost was in his feet, and he kept lifting first one forefoot and then the other. He curved his bushy tail around to cover them, and at the same time he saw a vision. There was nothing strange about it. Upon his inward sight was impressed a succession of memory pictures. He saw the camp again, the teepees and the blaze of the fires. He heard the shrill voices of the woman, the gruff basses of the men, the snarling of the dogs. He was hungry, and he remembered pieces of meat and fish that had been thrown him. Here was no meat, nothing but a threatening and inedible silence. His bondage had softened him. Irresponsibility had weakened him. He had forgotten how to shift for himself. The night yawned about him. His senses, accustomed to the hum and bustle of the camp, used to the continuous impact of sights and sounds, were now left idle. There was nothing to do, nothing to see nor hear. They strained to catch some interruption of the silence and immobility of nature. They were appalled by inaction and by the feel of something terrible impending. He gave a great start of fright. A colossal and formless something was rushing across the field of his vision. It was a tree shadow, flung by the moon, from whose face the clouds had been brushed away. Reassured, he whimpered softly. Then he suppressed the whimper for fear that it might attract the attention of the lurking dangers. A tree, contracting in the cool of the night, made a loud noise. It was directly above him. He yelped in his fright. A panic seized him, and he ran madly toward the village. He knew an overpowering desire for the protection and companionship of man. In his nostrils was the smell of the camp smoke. In his ears the camp sounds and cries were ringing loud. He passed out of the forest and into the moonlit open where were no shadows nor darknesses. But no village greeted his eyes. He had forgotten. The village had gone away. Take a second to look at this image here. So this is another one of those beautiful metal prints here, that the etching of the plate, and this would have been multi-layered etchings to get that swath of beautiful color and gradient. He felt the lurking of danger unseen and unguessed. Here it looks like Charles Livingston Bull opted for more of a dark gray wolf, almost black, which is interesting because I think White Fang would have looked like your typical gray wolf. Gray and white with like black guard hairs, and just an artistic choice. Beautiful detail though. Exquisite branches, the line work on to give like texture to the bark of the trees, all of which is faded, and the farther back you go, there's less distinction. You did. It has unfortunately ended, Higara, but thank you. Thank you for the gifted subs. I really appreciate it. And I hope that everyone that got one enjoys it as much too, including Alberon, your good friend. Yeah. The stones, the trees, the wolf, all of it is really well done. We return to the story. His wild flight ceased abruptly. There was no place to which to flee. He slunk forlornly through the deserted camp, smelling the rubbish heaps and the discarded rags and tags of the gods. He would have been glad for the rattle of stones about him, flung by an angry squaw, glad for the hand of Grey Beaver descending upon him in wrath, while he would have welcomed with delight Lip Lip and the whole snarling, cowardly pack. He came to where Grey Beaver's teepee had stood. In the center of the space it had occupied, he sat down. He pointed his nose at the moon. His throat was afflicted by rigid spasms. His mouth opened, and in a heartbroken cry bubbled up his loneliness and fear, his grief for Quiche, all his past sorrows and misery, as well as his apprehension of sufferings and dangers to come. It was the long wolf howl, full-throated and mournful, the first howl he had ever uttered. The coming of daylight dispelled his fears, but increased his loneliness. The naked earth, which so shortly before had been so populous, thrust his loneliness more forcibly upon him. It did not take him long to make up his mind. He plunged into the forest and followed the riverbank down the stream. All day he ran. He did not resist. He seemed made to run on forever. His iron-like body ignored fatigue, and even after fatigue came, his heritage of endurance braced him to endless endeavor and enabled him to drive his complaining body onward. Where the river swung in against precipitous bluffs, he climbed the high mountains behind. Rivers and streams that entered the main river he forded or swam. Often, he took to the rim ice that was beginning to form, and more than once he crashed through and struggled for life in the icy current. Always, he was on the lookout for the trail of the gods where it might leave the river and proceed inland. White Fang was intelligent beyond the average of his kind, yet his mental vision was not wide enough to embrace the other bank of the Mackenzie. What if the trail of the gods led out on that side? It never entered his head. Later on, when he had traveled more and grown older and wiser and come to know more of trails and rivers, it might be that he could grasp and apprehend such a possibility. That was an interesting word choice. Apprehend instead of comprehend. I wonder if it was just, because it would read More accurately, it might be that he could grasp and comprehend such a possibility. Just an interesting word choice. But that mental power was yet in the future. Just now he ran blindly, his own bank of the Mackenzie alone entering into his calculations. All night he ran, blundering in the darkness into mishaps and obstacles that delayed but did not daunt. By the middle of the second day he had been running continuously for 30 hours, and the iron of his flesh was giving out. It was the endurance of his mind that kept him going. He had not eaten in 40 hours, and he was weak with hunger. The repeated drenchings in the icy water had likewise had their effect on him. His handsome coat was draggled. The broad pads of his feet were bruised and bleeding. He had begun to limp, and this limp increased with the hours. To make it worse, the light of the sky was obscured and snow began to fall. A raw, moist, melting, clinging snow, slippery underfoot, that hid from him the landscape he traversed, and that covered over the inequalities of the ground so that the way of his feet was more difficult and painful. Grey Beaver had intended camping that night on the far bank of the Mackenzie, for it was in the direction that the hunting lay. But on the near bank, shortly before dark, a moose coming down to drink had espied by Clucooch, who was Grey Beaver's squaw. Now, had not the moose come down to drink, and had not Mitza been steering out of the course because of the snow, had not Clucooch sighted the moose, and had not Grey Beaver killed it with a lucky shot from his rifle, all subsequent things would have happened differently. Grey Beaver would not have camped on the near side of the Mackenzie, and White Fang would have passed by and gone on, either to die or to find his way to his wild brothers and become one of them. A wolf to the end of his days. Night had fallen. The snow was flying more thickly, and White Fang, whimpering softly to himself as he stumbled and limped along, came upon a fresh trail in the snow. So fresh was it that he knew it immediately for what it was. Whining with eagerness, he followed back from the river bank and in among the trees. The camp sounds came to his ears. He saw the blaze of the fire of Clucooch cooking, and Grey Beaver squatting on his hams and mumbling a chunk of raw tallow. There was fresh meat in camp. White Fang expected a beating. He crouched and bristled a little at the thought of it. Then he went forward again. He feared and disliked the beating he knew to be waiting for him. But he knew, further, that the comfort of the fire would be his, the protection of the gods, the companionship of the dogs. The last, a companionship of enmity, but none the less a companionship and satisfying to his gregarious needs. He came cringing and crawling into the firelight. Grey Beaver saw him and stopped munching the tallow. White Fang crawled slowly, cringing and groveling in the abjectness of his abasement and submission. He crawled straight toward Grey Beaver, every inch of his progress becoming slower and more painful. At last he lay at the master's feet, into whose possession he now surrendered himself, voluntarily, body and soul. Of his own choice he came in to sit by man's fire and to be ruled by him. White Fang trembled, waiting for the punishment to fall upon him. There was a movement of the hand above him. He cringed involuntarily under the expected blow. It did not fall. He stole a glance upward. Grey Beaver was breaking the lump of tallow in half. Grey Beaver was offering him one piece of the tallow. Very gently and somewhat suspiciously, he first smelled the tallow and then proceeded to eat it. Grey Beaver ordered meat to be brought to him and guarded him from the other dogs while he ate. After that, grateful and content, White Fang lay at Grey Beaver's feet, gazing at the fire that warmed him, blinking and dozing, secure in the knowledge that the morrow would find him not wandering forlorn through bleak forest stretches, but in the camp of the man-animals, with the gods to whom he had given himself and upon whom he was now dependent. Oh my. So, if he had not found that camp, White Fang may have become wholly wolf and wild and a creature of nature, but because he did, and he surrendered to his idea of man, he became more dog than wolf. Anyway, interesting, very interesting. So that was chapter 4. We're moving on to chapter 5. I know there's only a few of you today, but as a reminder, hydrate, caffeinate, take care of yourself, um, and, be sure to enjoy the story. Do the same. I'll give myself a big stretch. Oh, yeah, that's the good stuff. Whew. Okay. We are on chapter 5 of White Fang, the Covenant. When December was well along, Grey Beaver went on a journey up the Mackenzie. Mitsa and Klukuch went with him. One sled he drove himself, drawn by dogs he had traded for or borrowed. A second and smaller sled was driven by Mitsa, and to this was harnessed a team of puppies. It was more of a toy affair than anything else, yet it was the delight of Mitsa, who felt that he was beginning to do a man's work in the world. Also, he was learning to drive dogs and to train dogs, while the puppies themselves were being broken into the harness. Furthermore, the sled was of some service, for it carried nearly 200 pounds of outfit and food. White Fang had seen the camp dogs toiling in the harness, so that he did not resent overmuch the first placing of the harness upon himself. About his neck was put a moss-stuffed collar, which was connected by 2 pulling traces to a strap that passed around his chest and over his back. It was to this that was fastened the long rope by which he pulled at the sled. There were 7 puppies in the team. The others were born earlier in the year, were 9 and 10 months old, while White Fang was only 8 months old. Each dog was fastened to the sled by a single rope. No 2 ropes were of the same length, while the difference in length between any 2 ropes was at least that of a dog's body. Every rope was brought to a ring at the front end of the sled. The sled itself was without runners, being a birch bark toboggan, with upturned forward end to keep it from plowing under the snow. This construction enabled the weight of the sled and load to be distributed over the largest snow surface, for the snow was crystal powder and very soft. Observing the same principle of widest distribution of weight, the dogs at the end of their ropes radiated fan fashion from the nose of the sled so that no dog trod in another's footsteps. There was, furthermore, another virtue in the formation. The ropes of varying length prevented the dogs attacking from the rear those that ran in front of them. For a dog to attack another, it would have to turn upon one at a shorter rope, in which case it would find itself face to face with the dog attacked, and also would find itself facing the whip of the driver. But the most peculiar virtue of all lay in the fact that the dog that strove to attack one in front of him must pull the sled faster, and that the faster the sled traveled, the faster could the dog attacked run away. Thus the dog behind could never catch up with the one in front. The faster he ran, the faster ran the one he was after, and the faster ran all the dogs. Incidentally, the sled went faster, and thus by cunning indirection did man increase his mastery over the beasts. Mitsa resembled his father, much of whose grey wisdom he possessed. In the past he observed Lip Lip's persecution of White Fang, But at the same time, Lip Lip was another man's dog, and Mitsa had never dared more than to shy an occasional stone at him. But now Lip Lip was his dog, and he proceeded to wreak his vengeance on him by putting him at the end of the longest rope. This made Lip Lip the leader, and was apparently an honor, but in reality it took away from him all honor. Took away from him all honor, and instead of being bully and master of the pack, he now found himself hated and persecuted by the pack. Because he ran at the end of the longest rope, the dogs had always the view of him running away before them. All that they saw of him was his bushy tail and fleeing hind legs. A view far less ferocious and intimidating than his bristling mane and gleaming fangs. Also, dogs being so constituted in their mental ways, the sight of him running away gave desire to run after him, and a feeling that he ran away from them. The moment the sled started, the team took after Lip Lip in a chase that extended throughout the day. At first he had been prone to turn upon his pursuers, jealous of his dignity and wrathful. But at such times, Mitsa would throw the stinging lash of a 30-foot caribou gut whip into his face, and compel him to turn tail and run on. Lip Lip might face the pack, but he could not face that whip, and all that was left to him to do was to keep his long rope taut and his flanks ahead of the teeth of his mates. But a still greater cunning lurked in the recesses of the Indian mind. To give him point to unending pursuit of the leader, Mitsa favored him over the other dogs. These favors aroused in them jealousy and hatred. In their presence, Mitsa would give him meat, and would give it to him only. This was maddening to them. They would rage around just outside the throwing distance of the whip, while Lip Lip devoured the meat, and Mitsa protected him. And when there was no meat to give, Mitsa would keep the team at a distance and make believe to give meat to Lip Lip. White Fang took kindly to the work. He had traveled a greater distance than the other dogs in the yielding of himself to the rule of the gods. He had learned more thoroughly the futility of opposing their will. In addition, the persecution he had suffered from the pack had made the pack less to him in the scheme of things and man more. He had not learned to be dependent on his kind for companionship. Besides, Quiche was well nigh forgotten, and the chief outlet of his expression that remained to him was in the allegiance he tendered the gods he had accepted as masters. So he worked hard, learned discipline, and was obedient. Faithfulness and willingness characterized his toil. These are essential traits of the wolf and the wild dog when they have become domesticated, and these traits White Fang possessed in unusual measure. Oh, I forgot. Whatever. A companionship did exist between White Fang and the other dogs, but it was one of warfare and enmity. He had never learned to play with them. He knew only how to fight, and fight with them he did, returning to them 100-fold the snaps and slashes they had given him in the days when Lip Lip was leader of the pack. But Lip Lip was no longer leader, except when he fled away before his mates at the end of his rope, the sled bounding along behind. In camp, he kept close to Mitsa or Grey Beaver or Klukuch. He did not dare venture away from the gods, for now the fangs of all dogs were against him, and he tasted to the dregs the persecution that had been White Fang's. With the overthrow of Lip Lip, White Fang could have become leader of the pack, but he was too morose and solitary for that. He merely thrashed his teammates. Otherwise, he ignored them. They got out of his way when he came along, nor did the boldest of them ever dare to rob him of his meat. On the contrary, they devoured their own meat hurriedly, for fear that he would take it away from them. White Fang knew the law well, to oppress the weak and obey the strong. He ate his share of meat as rapidly as he could, and then woe the dog that had not yet finished. A snarl and a flash of fangs, and that dog would wail in indignation to the uncomforting stars while White Fang finished his portion for him. Every little while, however, one dog or another would flame up in revolt and be promptly subdued. Thus, White Fang was kept in training. He was jealous of the isolation in which he kept himself in the midst of the pack, and he fought often to maintain it. But such fights were of brief duration. He was too quick for the others. They were slashed open and bleeding before they knew what had happened, were whipped almost before they had begun to fight. As rigid as the sled discipline of the gods was the discipline maintained by White Fang amongst his fellows. He never allowed them any latitude. He compelled them to an unremitting respect for him. They might do as they pleased amongst themselves. That was no concern of his, but it was his concern that they leave him alone in his isolation, get out of his way when he elected to walk among them, and at all times acknowledge his mastery over them. A hint of stiff-leggedness on their part, a lifted lip or a bristle of hair, and he would be upon them, merciless and cruel, swiftly convincing them of the error of their way. He was a monstrous tyrant. His mastery was rigid as steel. He oppressed the weak with a vengeance. Not for nothing had he been exposed to the pitiless struggle for life in the days of his cubhood, when his mother and he, alone and unaided, held their own and survived in the ferocious environment of the wild, and not for nothing had he learned to walk softly when superior strength went by. He opposed the weak, but he respected the strong, and in the course of the long journey with Grey Beaver, he walked softly indeed amongst the full-grown dogs in the camps of the strange man-animals they encountered. The months passed by. Still continued the journey of Grey Beaver. White Fang's strength was developed by the long hours on trail and the steady toil at the sled. And would it have seemed that his mental development was well nigh complete. He had come to know quite thoroughly the world in which he lived. His outlook was bleak and materialistic. The world as he saw it was a fierce and brutal world, a world without warmth, a world in which caresses and affection and the bright sweetness of the spirit did not exist. He had no affection for Grey Beaver. True, he was a god, but a most savage god. White Fang was glad to acknowledge his lordship, but it was lordship based upon superior intelligence and brute strength. There was something in the fiber of White Fang's being that made his lordship a thing to be desired, else he would not have come back from the wild when he did to tender his allegiance. There were deeps in his nature which had never been sounded. A kind word, a caressing touch of the hand on the part of Grey Beaver might have sounded these deeps. But Grey Beaver did not caress nor speak kind words. It was not his way. His primacy was savage, and savagely he ruled, administering justice with a club, punishing transgression with the pain of a blow, and rewarding merit, not by kindness, but by withholding a blow. So, White Fang knew nothing of the heaven a man's hand might contain for him. Besides, he did not like the hands of the man-animals. He was suspicious of them. It was true that they sometimes gave meat, but more often they gave hurt. Hands were things to keep away from. They hurled stones, wielded sticks and clubs and whips, administered slaps and clouts, and when they touched him, were cunning to hurt with pinch and twist and wrench. In strange villages he had encountered the hands of the children and learned that they were cruel to hurt. Also, he had once nearly had an eye poked out by a toddling papoose. From these experiences, he became suspicious of all children. He could not tolerate them. When they came near with their ominous hands, he got up. It was in a village of the Great Slave Lake that, in the course of resenting the evil of the lands of the man animals, he came to modify the law that he learned from Grey Beaver, namely, that the unpardonable crime was to bite one of the gods. In this village, after the custom of all dogs in all villages, White Fang went foraging for food. A boy was chopping frozen moose meat with an axe, and the chips were flying in the snow. White Fang, sliding by in quest for meat, stopped and began to eat the chips. He observed the boy lay down the axe and take up a stout club. White Fang sprang clear just in time to escape the descending blow. The boy pursued him, and he, a stranger in the village, fled between two teepees to find himself cornered against a high earth bank. There was no escape for White Fang. The only way out was between the two teepees, and this boy guarded. Holding his club prepared to strike, he drew in on his cornered quarry. White Fang was furious. He faced the boy, bristling and snarling, his sense of justice outraged. He knew the law of forage. All the wastage of meat, such as the frozen chips, belonged to the dog that found it. He had done no wrong, broken no law, yet here was this boy preparing to give him a beating. White Fang scarcely knew what had happened. He did it in a surge of rage, and he did it so quickly that the boy did not know either. All the boy knew was that he had in some uncountable way been overturned in the snow, and that his club hand had been ripped wide open by White Fang's teeth. But White Fang knew that he had broken the law of the gods. He had driven his teeth into the sacred flesh of one of them, and could expect nothing but a most terrible punishment. He fled away to Grey Beaver, behind whose protecting legs he crouched, when the bitten boy and the boy's family came demanding vengeance. But they went away with vengeance unsatisfied. Grey Beaver defended White Fang, so did Mitsa and Klukuch. White Fang, listening to the wordy war and watching the angry gestures, knew that his act was justified. And so it came that he learned there were gods and gods. There were his gods and there were other gods, and between them there was a difference. Justice or injustice, it was all the same. He must take all things from the hands of his own gods. But he was not compelled to take injustice from the other gods. It was his privilege to resent it with his teeth, and this also was a law of the gods. Before the day was out, White Fang was to learn more about this law. Mitsa, alone, gathering firewood in the forest, encountered the boy that had been bitten. With him were other boys. Hot words passed. Then all the boys attacked Mitsa. It was going hard with him. Blows were raining upon him from all sides. White Fang looked on at first. This was an affair of the gods and no concern of his. Then he realized that this was Mitsa, one of his own particular gods, who had been maltreated. It was no reasoned impulse that made White Fang do what he then did. A mad rush of anger sent him leaping amongst the combatants. 5 minutes later, the landscape was covered with fleeing boys, many of whom dripped blood upon the snow in token that White Fang's teeth had not been idle. When Mitsa told his story in camp, Grey Beaver ordered meat to be given to White Fang. He ordered much meat to be given, and White Fang, gorged and sleepy by the fire, knew that the law had received his verification. It was a line with these specimens that White Fang came to learn the law of property and the duty of the defense of property. From the protection of his god's body to the protection of his god's possessions was a step, and this step he made. What was his god's was to be defended against all the world, even to the extent of biting other gods. Not only was such an act sacrilegious in its nature, but it was fraught with peril. The gods were all-powerful, and a dog was no match against them, yet White Fang learned to face them, fiercely, belligerent, and unafraid, Duty rose above fear, and thieving gods learned to leave Grey Beaver's property alone. One thing, in this connection, White Fang quickly learned, and that was that a thieving god was usually a cowardly god and prone to run away at the sounding of the alarm. Also, he learned that but brief time elapsed between his sounding of the alarm and Grey Beaver's coming to his aid. He came to know that it was not fear of him that drove the thief away, but fear of Grey Beaver. White Fang did not give the alarm by barking. He never barked. His method was to drive straight at the intruder and to sink his teeth in if he could. Because he was morose and solitary, having nothing to do with the other dogs, he was unusually fitted to guard his master's property. And in this he was encouraged and trained by Grey Beaver. One result of this was to make White Fang more ferocious and indomitable and more solitary. The months went by, binding stronger and stronger the covenant between dog and man. This was the ancient covenant that the first wolf that came in from the wild entered into with man. And, like all succeeding wolves and wild dogs that had done likewise, White Fang worked the covenant out for himself. The terms were simple. For the possession of a flesh and blood god, he exchanged his own liberty. Food and fire, protection and companionship were some of the things he received from the god. In return, he guarded the god's property, defended his body, worked for him, and obeyed him. The possession of a god implies service. White Fang's was a service of duty and awe, but not of love. He did not know what love was. He had no experience of love. Quiche was a remote memory. Besides, not only had he abandoned the wild and his kind when he gave himself up to man, but the terms of the covenant were such that if he ever met Quiche again, he would not desert his god to go with her. His allegiance to man seemed somewhat a law of his being greater than the love of liberty, of kind and kin. All right, another chapter in. Hey, Mara. Oh, nice, you got one of the wiggle emotes. Who's that one from? Mega Really Silly. Really silly. Watermelon. I was feeling the breeze. Yes. I watch too many Twitch people. VTubers. Way too many VTubers. Oh my goodness. Everybody's on that Helldivers grind right now. I think there's a couple people playing this grocery store game. I'm not quite sure. But, as we can see from that last chapter, White Fang is learning to become an incredible guard dog. And his actions, learned through impulse, have created a situation where his laws and his understanding of mankind, or humans, or his quote-unquote gods, has expanded. So we'll see where this goes in this next chapter. I think it's either 6 or 7 chapters in part 3. So we'll see where this finishes. After this next chapter, if it's one more chapter, we'll go ahead and read through that. I just want to finish section 3 before we move on, and we'll take a quick ad break at that time. So it's either after this chapter or after the next one, whichever one. We are on to chapter 6, and as a friendly reminder, please hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, do whatever it is that you need to do to take care of yourself. Let me just move that over just a skosh. There we go. So, buckle in, let's read another chapter. Chapter 6, The Famine. The spring of the year was at hand when Grey Beaver finished his long journey. It was April, and White Fang was a year old when he pulled into the home village, and was loosed from the harness by Mitsa. Though a long way from his full growth, White Fang, next to Lip Lip, was the largest yearling in the village. Both from his father, the wolf, and from Quiche, he had inherited stature and strength, and already he was measuring up alongside the full-grown dogs. But he had not yet grown compact. His body was slender and rangy, and his strength was more stringy than massive. His coat was the true wolf gray, and to all appearances he was true wolf himself. The quarter strain of dog he had inherited from Quiche had left no mark on him physically, though it played its part in his mental makeup. He wandered through the village, recognizing with staid satisfaction the various gods he had known before the long journey. Then there were the dogs, puppies growing up like himself, and grown dogs that did not look so large and formidable as the memory pictures he retained of them. Also, he stood less in fear of them than formerly, stalking among them with a certain careless ease that was as new to him as it was enjoyable. There was Basik, a grizzled old fellow that in his younger days had but to uncover his fangs to send Wild Fang cringing and crouching to the right about. From him, White Fang had learned much of his own insignificance, and from him he was now to learn much of the change and development that had taken place in himself. While Basik had been growing weaker with age, White Fang had been growing stronger with youth. It was at the cutting up of a moose, fresh killed, that White Fang learned of the changed relations in which he stood to the dog world. He had got for himself a hoof and part of the shin bone to which quite a bit of meat was attached, withdrawn from the immediate scrabble of the other dogs. In fact, out of sight behind a thicket, he was devouring his prize, when Basik rushed in upon him. Before he knew what he was doing, he had slashed the intruder twice and sprung clear. Basik was surprised by the other's temerity and swiftness of attack. He stood gazing stupidly across at White Fang, the raw, red shin bone between them. Basik was old, and already he had come to know the increasing valor of the dogs that had been his wont to bully. Bitter experiences these, which perforce he swallowed, calling upon all his wisdom to cope with them. In the old days, he would have sprung upon White Fang in a fury of righteous wrath, but now his waning powers would not permit such a course. He bristled fiercely and looked ominously across the shin bone at White Fang. And White Fang, resurrecting quite a deal of the old awe, seemed to wilt and to shrink in upon himself and grow small, as he cast about in his mind for a way to beat a retreat not too inglorious. And right here, Basik erred. Had he contented himself with looking fierce and ominous, all would have been well. White Fang, on the verge of retreat, would have retreated, leaving the meat to him. But Basik did not wait. He considered the victory already his and stepped forward to the meat. As he bent his head carelessly to smell it, White Fang bristled slightly. Even then it was not too late for Basik to retrieve the situation. Had he merely stood over the meat, head up and glowering, White Fang would have ultimately have slunk away. But the fresh meat was strong in Basik's nostrils, and greed urged him to take a bite of it. This was too much for White Fang. Fresh upon his months of mastery over his own teammates, it was beyond his self-control to stand idly by while another devoured the meat that belonged to him. He struck, after his custom without warning. With the first slash, Basik's right ear was ripped into ribbons. He was astounded at the suddenness of it. But more things, and more grievous ones, were happening with equal suddenness. He was knocked off his feet. His throat was bitten. While he was struggling to his feet, the young dog sank teeth twice into his shoulder. The swiftness of it was bewildering. He made a futile rush at White Fang, clipping the empty air with an outraged snap. The next moment his nose was laid open and he was staggering backward away from the meat. The situation was now reversed. White Fang stood over the shin bone, bristling and menacing, while Basik stood a little way off, preparing to retreat. He dared not risk a fight with this young lightning flash, and again he knew, and more bitterly, the enfeeblement of oncoming age. His attempt to maintain his dignity was heroic, calmly turning his back upon young dog and shinbone, as though both were beneath his notice and unworthy of consideration, he stalked grandly away. Nor until well out of sight did he stop to lick his bleeding wounds. The effect on White Fang was to give him a greater faith in himself and a greater pride. He walked less softly among the grown dogs. His attitude toward them was less compromising. Not that he went out of his way looking for trouble, far from it, but upon his way he demanded consideration. He stood upon his right to go his way unmolested, and to give trail to no dog. He had to be taken into account, that was all. He was no longer to be disregarded and ignored, as was the lot of puppies, and continued to be the lot of the puppies that were his teammates. They got out of the way, gave trail to the grown dogs, and gave up meat to them under compulsion. But White Fang, uncompanionable, solitary, morose, scarcely looking to right or left, redoubtable, forbidding of aspect, remote and alien, was accepted as an equal by his puzzled elders. They quickly learned to leave him alone, neither venturing hostile acts nor making overtures of friendliness. If they left him alone, he left them alone, a state of affairs that they found, after a few encounters, to be preeminently desirable. In midsummer, White Fang had an experience. Trotting along in his silent way to investigate a new teepee which had been erected on the edge of the village while he was away with the hunters after moose, he came full upon Quiche. He paused and looked at her. He remembered her vaguely, but he remembered her, and that was more than could be said for her. She lifted her lip at him in the old snarl of menace, and his memory became clear. His forgotten cubhood, all that was associated with that familiar snarl, rushed back to him. Before he had known the gods, she had been to him the centerpin of the universe. The old familiar feelings of that time came back upon him, surged up within him. He bounded toward her joyously, and she met him with shrewd fangs that laid his cheek open to the bone. He did not understand. He backed away, bewildered and puzzled. But it was not Quiche's fault. A wolf mother was not made to remember her cubs of a year or so before. So she did not remember White Fang. He was a strange animal, an intruder, and her present litter of puppies gave her the right to resent such intrusion. One of the puppies sprawled up to White Fang. They were half-brothers, only they did not know it. White Fang sniffed the puppy curiously, whereupon Quiche rushed upon him, gashing his face a second time. He backed farther away. All the old memories and associations died down again, and passed into the grave from which they had been resurrected. He looked at Quiche, licking her puppy, and stopping now and then to snarl at him. She was without value to him. He had learned to get along without her. Her meaning was forgotten. There was no place for her in his scheme of things, as there was no place for him in hers. He was still standing, stupid and bewildered, the memories forgotten, wondering what it was all about, when Quiche attacked him a third time, intent on driving him away altogether from the vicinity. And White Fang allowed himself to be driven away. This was a female of his kind, and it was a law of his kind that the males must not fight the females. He did not know anything about this law, for it was no generalization of the mind, not a something acquired by experience in the world. He knew it as a secret prompting, as an urge of instinct, of the same instinct that made him howl at the moon and stars of nights, and that made him fear death and the unknown. The months went by. White Fang grew stronger, heavier, and more compact. While his character was developing along the lines laid down by his heredity and his environment, his heredity was a life stuff that may be likened to clay. It possessed many possibilities, was capable of being molded into many different forms. Environment served to model the clay, to give it a particular form. Thus had White Fang never come into the fires of man. The wild would have molded him into a true wolf, but the gods had given him a different environment, and he was molded into a dog that was rather wolfish, but that was a dog and not a wolf. And so, according to the clay of his nature and the pressure of his surroundings, his character was being molded into a certain particular shape. There was no escaping it. He was becoming more morose, more uncompanionable, more solitary, more ferocious. While the dogs were learning more and more that it was better to be at peace with him than at war, and Grey Beaver was coming to prize him more greatly with the passage of each day. White Fang, seeming to sum up strength in all his qualities, nevertheless suffered from one besetting weakness. He could not stand being laughed at. The laughter of men was a hateful thing. They might laugh among themselves, about anything they pleased except himself, and he did not mind. But the moment laughter was turned upon him, he would fly into a most terrible rage. Grave, dignified, somber, a laugh made him frantic to ridiculousness. It so outraged him and upset him that for hours he would behave like a demon, and woe to the dog that at such times ran foul of him. He knew the law too well to take it out on Grey Beaver. Behind Grey Beaver were a club and Godhead. But behind the dogs there was nothing but space. And into this space they fled when White Fang came on the scene, made mad by laughter. In the 3rd year of his life, there came a great famine to the Mackenzie Indians. In the summer, the fish failed. In the winter, the caribou forsook their accustomed track. Moose were scarce, the rabbits almost disappeared. Hunting and preying animals perished. Denied their usual food supply, weakened by hunger, they fell upon and devoured one another. Only the strong survived. White Fang's gods were also hunting animals. The old and the weak of them died of hunger. There was wailing in the village, where the women and children went without in order that what little they had might go into the bellies of the lean and hollow-eyed hunters who trod the forest in vain pursuit of meat. To such an extremity were the gods driven that they ate the soft tanned leather of their moccasins and mittens, while the dogs ate the harnesses off their backs and the very whip-lashes. Also the dogs ate one another, and also the gods ate the dogs. The weakest and more worthless were eaten first. The dogs that still lived looked on and understood. A few of the boldest and wisest forsook the fires of the gods, which had now become a shambles, and fled into the forest, where, in the end, they starved to death or were eaten by wolves. In this time of misery, White Fang too stole away into the woods. He was better fitted for the life than the other dogs, for he had the training of his cubhood to guide him. Especially adept did he become in stalking small, living things. He would lie concealment for hours, following every movement of a cautious tree squirrel, waiting, with a patience as huge as the hunger he suffered from, until the squirrel ventured out upon the ground. Even then, White Fang was not premature. He waited until he was sure of striking before the squirrel could gain a tree refuge. Then, and not until then, would he flash from his hiding place a gray projectile, incredibly swift, never failing its mark. The fleeing squirrel that fled not fast enough. Successful as he was with squirrels, there was one difficulty that prevented him from living and growing fat on them. There were not enough squirrels. So he was driven to hunt still smaller things. So acute did his hunger become at times that he was not above rooting out wood mice from their burrows in the ground, nor did he scorn to do battle with a weasel as hungry as himself and many times more ferocious. In the worst pinches of the famine, he stole back to the fires of the gods. But he did not go in to the fires. He lurked in the forest, avoiding discovery and robbing the snares at the rare intervals when game was caught. He even robbed Grey Beaver's snare of a rabbit at a time when Grey Beaver staggered and tottered through the forest, sitting down often to rest. What of weakness and of shortness of breath! One day, White Fang encountered a young wolf, gaunt and scrawny, loose jointed with famine. Had he not been hungry himself, White Fang might have gone with him and eventually found his way into the pack amongst his wild brethren. As it was, he ran the young wolf down and killed and ate him. Fortune seemed to favor him. Always, when hardest pressed for food, he found something to kill. Again, when he was weak, it was his luck that none of the larger preying animals chanced upon him. Thus, he was strong from the 2 days' eating a lynx had afforded him, when the hungry wolf pack ran full tilt upon him. It was a long, cruel chase, but he was better nourished than they, and in the end outran them. And not only did he outrun them, but, circling widely back on his track, he gathered in one of his exhausted pursuers. After that, he left the part of the country and journeyed over to the valley wherein he had been born. Here, in the old lair, he encountered Quiche. Up to her old tricks, she too had fled the inhospitable fires of the gods and gone back to her old refuge to give birth to her young. Of this litter, but one remained alive when White Fang came upon the scene, and this one was not destined to live long. Young life had little chance in such a famine. Quiche's greeting of her grown son was anything but affectionate, but White Fang did not mind. He had outgrown his mother, so he turned tail philosophically and trotted on up the stream. At the forks he took the turning to the left, where he found the lair of the lynx with whom his mother and he had fought long before. Here, in the abandoned lair, he settled down and rested for a day. During the early summer, in the last days of the famine, he met Lip Lip, who had likewise taken to the woods, where he had eked out a miserable existence. White Fang came upon him unexpectedly. Trotting in opposite directions along the base of a high bluff, they rounded a corner of rock and found themselves face to face. They paused with instant alarm and looked at each other suspiciously. White Fang was in splendid condition. His hunting had been good, and for a week he had eaten his fill. He was even gorged from his latest kill, but in the moment he looked at Lip Lip, his hair rose on end all along his back. It was an involuntary bristling on his part, the physical state that in the past had always accompanied the mental state produced in him by Lip Lip's bullying and persecution. As in the past, he had bristled and snarled at sight of Lip Lip. So now, and automatically, he bristled and snarled. He did not waste any time. The thing was done thoroughly and with dispatch. Lip Lip essayed to back away, but White Fang struck him hard, shoulder to shoulder. Lip Lip was overthrown and rolled upon his back. White Fang's teeth drove into the scrawny throat. There was a death struggle, during which White Fang walked around, stiff-legged and observant. Then he resumed his course and trotted on along the base of the bluff. One day, not long after, he came to the edge of the forest where a narrow stretch of open land sloped down to the Mackenzie. He had been over this ground before when it was bare, but now a village occupied it. Still, hidden amongst the trees, he paused to study the situation. Sights and sounds and scents were familiar to him. It was the old village changed to a new place, but sights and sounds and smells were different from those he had last had when he fled away from it. There was no whimpering nor wailing. Contented sounds saluted his ear, and when he heard the angry voice of a woman he knew it to be the anger that proceeds from a full stomach. And there was a smell in the air of fish. There was food. The famine was gone. He came out boldly from the forest and trotted into camp straight to Grey Beaver's teepee. Grey Beaver was not there, but Clucooch welcomed him with glad cries and a whole of a fresh caught fish, and he lay down to wait Grey Beaver's coming. Dun dun dun. So, Quiche returned to her den and again whelped some pups, and only one survived. He returned to his own hunting grounds and defeated the number one bully he had had, who did not survive half so well in the wild as he had. I don't foresee, now that he's got another year upon him, him having anywhere near the difficulties as a closer to being an adult dog. So, it's about 10 past the hour. I am due for a quick ad break, at which time I'll go ahead and go use the restroom before we start part 4. And we'll see how far we get into part 4 today, before, we wrap up and see how I'm feeling. I did about 2 hours last Wednesday, or, a couple of days ago. I think I can surpass 2 hours today, but we'll just see how I'm feeling. It depends on how long the chapters are. So, hang tight. We'll be back in 3 minutes. And we have returned. Bit of a quieter group today, and that's okay. A little, I'm not entirely sure that this story is for everyone. It's brutal in its wildness, it's raw, it's nature itself. Indomitable of spirit as White Fang is, clearly there is a lot of violence. But to eat or be eaten is the way of nature, especially here. Um, Actually, I'm kind of curious where the Mackenzie River is, and I'd be kind of curious to see where that is. Let's find out. Wo ist die Bibliotheca? Where is Mackenzie River from? Oh my goodness. There we go. The name of the river frequently mentioned in Jack London's novel White Fang is the Mackenzie River, a river that forms today's border between the Yukon Territory and the Northwest Territories of Canada. I wonder if there's a picture. Dun dun dun. Ah, okay. Let's see what that looks like. The Mackenzie River. So we have here the Yukon Territory, the farthest west territory of Canada, which kind of overlaps. Alaska has a lot of the same terrain. And so this Mackenzie River runs from the Arctic Sea all the way down to the lakes here. Fascinating. And I'm sure over time, that 100 some odd years, there's probably numerous changes in the course of the river over a century. Fascinating. The more you know. Okay. We are going into part 4 of 5 of Jack London's White Fang, and we'll be beginning part 4, The Superior Gods, chapter 1. Ooh, there's another image here. Again, unfortunately, a number of these images have been they were probably like printed in like a dark brown ink, but as you can see, the yellowing of this page, the acidity of the paper then, we use a much lower acidity of paper now, would have slowly eaten the stain. If I was to hazard a guess, I think would probably have been walnut ink or stain, probably ink, that made this image, and then the acidity of the paper would have eaten the ink and turned it this lovely orange hue. It's very soft. I like this color. But yeah, we have, I'm guessing, the moon in the night sky, possibly snow falling, trees in the foreground here, and then the mountains and the lake. It's very pretty. Okay, let's get started. Chapter 1, The Enemy of His Kind. Had there been in White Fang's nature any possibility, no matter how remote, of his ever coming to fraternize with his kind, such possibility was irretrievably destroyed when he was made leader of the sled team. For now the dogs hated him. Hated him for the extra meat bestowed upon him by Mitsa. Hated him for all the real and fancied favors he received. Hated him for that he fled always at the head of the team, his waving brush of a tail, and his perpetually retreating hindquarters forever maddening their eyes. And White Fang just as bitterly hated them back. Being sled leader was anything but gratifying to him. To be compelled to run away before the yelling pack, every dog of which for 3 years he had thrashed and mastered, was almost more than he could endure. But endure it he must, or perish. And the life that was in him had no desire to perish. The moment Mitsa gave his order for the start, that moment the whole team, with eager, savage cries, sprang forward at White Fang. There was no defense for him. If he turned upon them, Mitsa would throw the stinging lash of the whip into his face. Only remained to him to run away. He could not encounter that howling horde with his tail and hindquarters. These were scarcely fit weapons with which to meet the many merciless fangs. So run away he did, violating his own nature and pride with every leap he made, and leaping all day long. One cannot violate the promptings of one's nature without having that nature recoil upon itself. Such a recoil is like that of a hair made to grow out from the body, turning unnaturally upon the direction of its growth and growing into the body. A rankling, festering thing of hurt. And so with White Fang, every urge of his being impelled him to spring upon the pack that cried at his heels. But it was the will of the gods that this should not be, and behind the will, to enforce it, was the whip of a caribou gut, with its biting 30-foot lash. So, White Fang could only eat his heart in bitterness and develop a hatred and malice commiserate with the ferocity and indomitability of his nature. If ever a creature was the enemy of its kind, White Fang was that creature. He asked no quarter, gave none. He was continually marred and scarred by the teeth of the pack, and as continually he left his own marks upon the pack. Unlike most leaders, who, when camp was made and the dogs were unhitched, huddled near to the gods for protection, White Fang disdained such protection. He walked boldly about the camp, inflicting punishment in the night for what he had suffered in the day. In the time before he was made leader of the team, the pack had learned to get out of his way, but now it was different. Excited by the day-long pursuit of him, swayed subconsciously by the insistent irritation on their brains of the sight of him fleeing away, mastered by the feeling of mastery enjoyed all day, the dogs could not bring themselves to give way to him. When he appeared amongst them, there was always a squabble. His progress was marked by snarl and snap and growl. The very atmosphere he breathed was surcharged with hatred and malice, and this but served to increase the hatred and malice within him. When Mitsa cried out his command for the team to stop, White Fang obeyed. At first this caused trouble for the other dogs. All of them would spring upon the hated leader, only to find the tables turned. Behind him would be Mitsa, the great whip singing in his hand, so the dogs came to understand that when the team stopped by order, White Fang was to be let alone. But when White Fang stopped without orders, then it was allowed them to spring upon him and destroy him if they could. After several experiences, White Fang never stopped without orders. He learned quickly. It was in the nature of things that he must learn quickly if he were to survive the unusually severe conditions under which life was vouchsafed him. But the dogs could never learn the lesson to leave him alone in camp. Each day, pursuing him and crying defiance at him, the lesson of the previous night was erased. And that night would have to be learned over again, to be as immediately forgotten. Besides, there was a greater consistence in their dislike of him. They sensed between themselves and him a difference of kind, cause sufficient in itself for hostility. Like him, they were domesticated wolves, but they had been domesticated for generations. Much of the wild had been lost, so that to them the wild was the unknown, the terrible, the ever menacing and ever warring. But to him, In appearance and action and impulse, still clung the wild. He symbolized it. It was its personification, so that when they showed their teeth to him, they were defending themselves against the powers of destruction that lurked in the shadows of the forest and in the dark beyond the campfire. But there was one lesson the dogs did learn, and that was to keep together. White Fang was too terrible for any of them to face single-handed. They met him with the mass formation. Otherwise, he would have killed them, one by one, in a night. As it was, he never had a chance to kill them. He might roll a dog off its feet, but the pack would be upon him before he could follow up and deliver the deadly throat stroke. At the first hint of conflict, the whole team drew together and faced him. The dogs had quarrels among themselves, but these were forgotten when trouble was brewing with White Fang. Before we go on to that next paragraph here, this is another beautiful image by Charles Livingston Bull. As you can see, these are very traditional huskies. Very, very traditional looking huskies. They even included some red here from fighting and brawling. To him, in appearance and action and impulse, still clung the wild. Whereas our dear White Fang, stoic, dark gray, looking over his peers, superior to them, more wild, masterful of the natural world than they. Yeah, some of these are Siberian Huskies too. Just variation. There's so many different variations of Huskies. Blacks, browns, grays. I've seen some red ones now that I think about it. Different tones, but usually have some sort of white markings on them. Beautiful dogs, absolutely beautiful. Why people want them in the lower 48 where it's too hot for them to live, I'll have no idea. Anyway, gorgeous image. Yeah, I think depends on the type of the ink. These inks are usually made with mineral pigments. So the blues and the grays and the blacks are made from like broken up charcoal and other, probably not charcoal, but other inorganic matter. Whereas the sepia dark brown would have been made of walnut, like crushed walnut to make that ink. So the acid reacted chemically with that, as opposed to like these are just crushed minerals which have no reaction to the acidity of the paper. Anyway, this one, I think this is probably my favorite thus far in the book of all of his works. It's really nicely done. Here we go. On the other hand, try as they would, they could not kill White Fang. He was too quick for them, too formidable, too wise. He avoided tight places and always backed out of it when they bade fair to surround him. While, as for getting him off his feet, there was no dog among them capable of doing the trick. His feet clung to the earth with the same tenacity that he clung to life. For that matter, life and footing were synonymous in the unending warfare with the pack, and none knew it better than White Fang. Hey, Wild, welcome in. It was nice getting to watch that, zombie film on Tiny's stream earlier. I really enjoyed it. I can't wait for the next one. That'll be really fun. Also, for those of you not in the know, Wildosis, Wildosis and Tiny Draculina are amazing, like horror-based VTubers. Fantastic models, great characters. Their voices are mwah, like have this amazing tone. So if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. Let me go ahead and throw a shout out here. Of course. Let's see, that should pop up here in a second.
A fucking. Oh my god, I got killed by a fucking Dio!
Oh, look at the old models.
So that means.
Jotaro!
I'm so drunk.
about
I'm
to
taking
make
notes
that joke.
very slowly.
I was about to go. You
Oh, that
thought
must
it was
have been
a
some time back.
You thought it was a demon, but it was I, Dio.
Yeah, well, it just
Dio.
randomly draws from the clips, so it's always interesting. I wonder if it'll show a newer one of Tiny. Let's see. What shall it show? Da, 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 da.
Actually, that's the first cum I've had all stream.
What? What? Okay. Yes, Tiny Draculina, tiny vampire, gorgeous crimson hair, playing grave digger, I believe there. Gravekeeper, I think. Yeah, probably. That one was pretty funny though, but if you are not following them already, I highly recommend them both. Great content. D&D, horror games, horror movies, recaps, discussions, anything based like in classic horror. And I imagine if there wasn't, crazy copyright infringement issues or concerns, they would probably cover more modern content as well cuz it's good stuff. I think you have your own Discord server, everything. I think they do some movie showings there as well. And one of these upcoming times I'll be able to join in if I can find a good username. If I can find a good username. Well, for not having a good username, I think that one's not half bad. So, welcome in. But yeah, if you're not already checking out their content, I highly recommend it. And it really is. I can't find a good username. Not being able to find one, you came up with something that is highly amusing and will work just fine until you find something you like better. If that ever happens. I digress. We return to White Fang, and for you new listeners or folks that aren't familiar with my content, hi, I am Vexing Cat. I read primarily classic literature, poetry. I'm currently in the process of reading Jack London's White Fang. So if you're not familiar with his work, American author, self-made millionaire, Fallen, thank you. Thank you so much, Fallen. Welcome in. Let's see. Let me grab my raid message for practice. Fallen, thank you for dropping in with your folks today. I appreciate that. And entering from stage left, sneaking in quietly. Yes. Welcome in, raiders. Welcome to my library. If this is your first time visiting, I am Vexing Cat, a retro tiger librarian. I read classic literature and poetry, and occasionally play various video games. Feel free to take a moment to get yourself settled in, caffeinate, hydrate, grab a snack, grab a blanket, curl up, get cozy. I am currently reading Jack London's White Fang, and I appreciate you dropping in. Fallen, you were still going before I got started today, so I'm not at all surprised. Wild, Fallen, Wild, you're both from the UK. I like both of your content. Good vibes all around. So if you guys haven't checked out each other, highly recommend you doing so. All right, let's get back to the story, since that's what most of you are here for. I believe we finished. Yes. So, he became the enemy of his kind, domesticated wolves that they were, softened by the fires of man, weakened in the sheltering shadow of man's strength. White Fang was bitter and implacable. The clay of him was so molded, he declared a vendetta against all dogs. And so terribly did he live this vendetta that Grey Beaver, fierce savage himself, could not but marvel at White Fang's ferocity. Never, he swore, had there been the like of this animal, and and the Indians in strange villages swore likewise when they considered the tale of his killings amongst their dogs. When White Fang was nearly 5 years old, Grey Beaver took him on another great journey, and long remembered was the havoc he worked amongst the dogs of the many villages along the Mackenzie, across the Rockies, and down the Porcupine to the Yukon. He reveled in the vengeance he wreaked upon his kind. They were ordinary, unsuspecting dogs. They were not prepared for his swiftness and directness, for his attack without warning. They did not know him for what he was, a lightning flash of slaughter. They bristled up to him, stiff-legged and challenging, while he, wasting no time on elaborate preliminaries, snapping into action like a steel spring, was at their throats and destroying them before they knew what was happening and while they were yet in the throes of surprise. He became an adept at fighting. He economized. He never wasted his strength, never tussled. He was too quick for that, and if he missed, was out again too quickly. Hi, Copyright 53. The dislike of the wolf for close quarters was his to an unusual degree. He could not endure a prolonged contact with another body. It smacked of danger. It made him frantic. He must be away, free on his own legs, touching no living thing. It was the wild, still clinging to him, asserting itself through him. This feeling had been accentuated by the Ishmaelite life he had led from his puppyhood. During dark, danger lurked in contacts. It was a trap, ever the trap, the fear of it lurking deep in the life of him, woven into the fiber of him. Going pretty well, Copyright. We're just continuing where we left off from Wednesday. In consequence, the strange dogs he encountered had no chance against him. He eluded their fangs. He got them, or got away, himself untouched in either event. In the natural course of things, there were exceptions to this. There were times when several dogs, pitching on to him, punished him before he could get away. And there were times when a single dog scored deeply on him. But these were accidents. In the main, so efficient a fighter had he become, he went his way unscathed. Another advantage he possessed was that of correctly judging time and distance. Not that he did this consciously, however. He did not calculate such things. It was all automatic. His eye saw correctly, and the nerves carried the vision correctly to his brain. The parts of him were better adjusted than those of the average dog. They worked together more smoothly and steadily. His was a better, far better, nervous, mental, and muscular coordination. When his eyes conveyed to his brain the moving image of an action, his brain, without conscious effort, knew the space that limited that action and the time required for its completion. Thus, he could avoid the leap of another dog or the drive of its fangs, and at the same moment could seize the infinitesimal fraction of time in which to deliver his own attack. Body and brain, his was a more perfected mechanism. Not that he was to be praised for it. Nature had been more generous to him than to the average animal. That was all. It was in the summer that White Fang arrived at Fort Yukon. Grey Beaver had crossed the great watershed between the Mackenzie and the Yukon in the late winter, and spent the spring in hunting among the western outlying spurs of the Rockies. Then, after the breakup of the ice on the Porcupine, he had built a canoe and paddled down the stream to where it effected its junction with the Yukon, just under the Arctic Circle. Here stood the old Hudson's Bay Company fort, and here were many Indians, much food, and unprecedented excitement. It was the summer of 1898, and thousands of gold hunters were going up the Yukon to Dawson and the Klondike. Nevertheless, many of them had been on the way for a year, and the least any of them had traveled to get that far was 5,000 miles, while some had come from the other side of the world. Here Grey Beaver stopped. A whisper of the gold rush had reached his ears, and he had come with several bales of furs and another of gut-sewn mittens and moccasins. He would not have ventured so long a trip had he not expected generous profits. But what he had expected was nothing to what he realized. His wildest dream had not exceeded 100%. Profit. He made 1,000%. And like a true Indian, he settled down to trade carefully and slowly, even if it took all summer, then the rest of the winter, to dispose of his goods. It was at Fort Yukon that White Fang saw his first white men. As compared with the Indians he had known, they were to him another race of beings, a race of another race of gods. They impressed him as possessing superior power, and it is on power that Godhead rests. White Fang did not reason it out, did not in his mind make the sharp generalization that the white gods were more powerful. It was a feeling, nothing more, and yet none the less potent. As in puppyhood, the looming bulks of the teepees man reared had affected him as manifestations of power. So he was affected now by the houses and the huge fort, all the massive logs. Here was power. These gods were strong. They possessed greater mastery over matter than the gods he had known, most powerful among which was Grey Beaver. And yet Grey Beaver was a child god among these ones. To be sure, White Fang only felt these things. He was not conscious of them, yet it is upon feeling more often than thinking that animals act, and every act White Fang now performed was based upon the feeling that the men were the superior gods. In the first place, he was very suspicious of them. There was no telling what unknown terrors were theirs, what unknown hurts they could administer. He was curious to observe them, fearful of being noticed by them. For the first few hours he was content with slinking around and watching them from a safe distance. Then he saw that no harm befell the dogs that were near to them, and he came in closer. In turn, he was an object of great curiosity to them. His wolfish appearance caught their eyes at once, and they pointed him out to one another. This act of pointing put White Fang on his guard, and when they tried to approach him, he showed his teeth and backed away. Not one succeeded in laying a hand on him, and it was well that they did not. White Fang soon learned that very few of these gods, not more than a dozen, lived at this place. Every 2 or 3 days a steamer, another and colossal manifestation of power, came in to the bank and stopped for several hours. The men came from off these steamers and went away on them again. There seemed untold numbers of these men. In the first day or so he saw more of them than he had seen Indians in all his life, and as the days went by, they continued to come up the river, stop, and then go on up the river and out of sight. But if the gods were all-powerful, their dogs did not amount to much. This White Fang quickly discovered by mixing with those that came ashore with their masters. They were of irregular shapes and sizes. Some were short-legged, too short. Others were long-legged, too long. They had hair instead of fur, and a few had very little hair at that, and none of them knew how to fight. As an enemy of his kind, it was in White Fang's province to fight with them. This he did, and he quickly achieved for them a mighty contempt. They were soft and helpless, made much noise and floundered around clumsily, trying to accomplish by main strength what he accomplished by dexterity and cunning. They rushed, bellowing at him. He sprang to the side. They did not know what had become of him, and in that moment he struck them on the shoulder, rolling them off their feet and delivering his stroke at the throat. Sometimes the stroke was successful, and a stricken dog rolled in the dirt to be pounced upon and torn to pieces by the pack of dogs that waited. White Fang was wise. He had long since learned that the gods were made angry when their dogs were killed. The men were no exception to this. So he was content, when he had overthrown and slashed wide the throat of one of their dogs, to drop back and let the pack go in and do the cruel finishing work. It was then that the men rushed in, visiting their wrath heavily on the pack, while White Fang went free. He would stand off at a little distance and look on, while stones, clubs, axes, and all sorts of weapons fell upon his fellows. White Fang was very wise. But his fellows grew wise in their own way, and in this White Fang grew wise with them. They learned that it was when a steamer first tied to the bank that they had their fun. After the first 2 or 3 strange dogs had been downed and destroyed, the men hustled their own animals back on board and wreaked savage vengeance on the offenders. One man, having seen his dog, a setter, torn to pieces before his eyes, drew a revolver. He fired rapidly, 6 times, and 6 of the pack lay dead or dying. Another manifestation of power that sank deep into White Fang's consciousness. White Fang enjoyed it all. He did not love his kind, and he was shrewd enough to escape hurt himself. At first, the killing of the men's dogs had been a diversion. After a time, it became his occupation. There was no work for him to do. Grey Beaver was busy trading and getting wealthy, so White Fang hung around the landing with a disreputable gang of dogs, waiting for steamers. With the arrival of a steamer, the fun began. After a few minutes, by the time the men had got over their surprise, the gang scattered. The fun was over until the next steamer should arrive. But it can scarcely be said that White Fang was a member of the gang. He did not mingle with it, but remained aloof, always himself, and was even feared by it. It is true, he worked with it. He picked the quarrel with the strange dog while the gang waited, and when he had overthrown the strange dog, the gang went in to finish it. But it is equally true that he then withdrew, leaving the gang to receive the punishment of the outraged gods. He did not require much exertion to pick these quarrels. All he had to do when the strange dogs came ashore was to show himself. When they saw him, they rushed for him. It was their instinct. He was the wild, the unknown, the terrible, the ever menacing, the thing that prowled in the darkness around the fires of the primeval world when they, cowering close to the fires, were reshaping their instincts, learning to fear the wild out of which they had come, and which they had deserted and betrayed. Generation by generation, down all the generations, had this fear of the wild been stamped into their natures. For centuries, the wild had stood for terror and destruction. And during all this time, free license had been theirs, from their masters, to kill the things of the wild. In doing this, they had protected both themselves and the gods whose companionship they shared. And so, fresh from the soft southern world, these dogs, trotting down the gangplank and out upon the Yukon shore, had but to see White Fang to experience the irresistible impulse to rush upon him and destroy him. They might be town-reared dogs, but the instinctive fear of the wild was theirs just the same. Not alone with their own eyes did they see the wolfish creature in the clear light of day standing before them. They saw him with the eyes of their ancestors, and by their inherited memory they knew White Fang for the wolf, and they remembered the ancient feud, all of which served to make White Fang's days enjoyable. If the sight of him drove these strange dogs upon him, so much the better for him, so much the worse for them. They looked upon him as legitimate prey, and as legitimate prey he looked upon them. Not for nothing had he first seen the light of day in a lonely lair, and fought his first fights with the ptarmigan, the weasel, and the lynx. and not for nothing had his puppyhood been made bitter by the persecution of Lip Lip and the whole puppy pack. It might have been otherwise, and he would then have been otherwise. Had had Lip Lip not existed, he would have passed his puppyhood with the other puppies and grown up more dog-like and with more liking for dogs. Had Grey Beaver possessed the plummet of affection and love, he might have sounded the deeps of White Fang's nature and brought up to the surface all manner of kindly qualities. But these things had not been so. The clay of White Fang had been molded until he became what he was, morose and lonely, unloving and ferocious, the enemy of all his kind. Oh, my goodness. Oh, good. Somebody crossed out the word I don't want to see. Fantastic. For those of you not aware, I just want to preface that there is some language in this book. It was written in 1906. It's not excusable, but it's including some antiquated terms and turns of phrase that I don't approve of, nor do I use or condone the use of in modern day context. One of which is the word that has been crossed out, which I will not be saying. These were not Indians. These were Native Americans, right? These were not, the quote unquote white men that came up to go gold mining. They were interlopers. They did not belong here. So there's just, there's just some language in here that Anyway, I digress. We are in between chapters, so as a friendly reminder, please hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack if you need to. I'm gonna, depending how long this chapter is, I'll read this one and one more, and then I'll wrap up for today, and that'll save, because we're about 2/3 through the book at this point. And I think the chapters have been ranging around 20 pages, give or take. But I, for one, am very, very thirsty, and I am hydrating. So if you're not doing so, I highly recommend it. Chapter 2. The Mad God. A small number of men lived in Fort Yukon. These men had been long in the country. They called themselves sourdoughs, and took great pride in so classifying themselves. For other men, new men in the land, they felt nothing but disdain. The men who came ashore from the steamers were newcomers. They were known as chichacos, and they always wilted at the application of the name. They made their bread with baking powder. This was the invidious distinction between them and the sourdoughs, who, forsooth, made their bread from sourdough because they had no baking powder. All of which is neither here nor there. The men in the fort disdained the newcomers and enjoyed seeing them come to grief. Especially did they enjoy the havoc worked amongst the newcomers' dogs by White Fang and his disreputable gang. When a steamer arrived, the men of the fort made it a point always to come down to the bank and see the fun. They looked forward to it with as much anticipation as did the dogs, while they were not slow to appreciate the savage and crafty part played by White Fang. But there was one man amongst them who particularly enjoyed the sport. He would come running at the first sound of the steamboat's whistle, and when the last fight was over and White Fang and the pack had scattered, he would return slowly to the fort, his face heavy with regret. Sometimes, when the soft Southland dog went down, shrieking its death cry under the fangs of the pack, this man would be unable to contain himself, and would leap into the air and cry out with delight. And always he had a sharp and covetous eye for White Fang. This man was called Beauty by the other men of the fort. No one knew his first name, and in general he was known in the country as Beauty Smith. But he was anything save a beauty. To antithesis was due his naming. He was preeminently unbeautiful. Nature had been unkind with him. He was a small man to begin with, and upon his meager frame was deposited an even more strikingly meager head. Its apex might be likened to a point. In fact, in his boyhood, before he had been named Beauty by his fellows, he had been called Pinhead. Backward from the apex, his head slanted down to his neck, and forward it slanted uncompromisingly to meet a low and remarkably wide forehead. Beginning here, as though regretting her parsimony, Nature had spread his features with a lavish hand. His eyes were large, and between them was a distance of 2 eyes. His face, in relation to the rest of him, was prodigious. In order to discover the necessary area, Nature had given him an enormous prognathous jaw. It was wide and heavy, protruded outward and down until it seemed to rest on his chest. Possibly his appearance was due to the weariness of his slender neck, unable properly to support so great a burden. This jaw gave the impression of ferocious determination. But something lacked. Perhaps it was from excess. Perhaps the jaw was too large. At any rate, it was a lie. Beauty Smith was known far and wide as the weakest of weak-kneed and sniveling cowards. To complete his description, his teeth were large and yellow, while the 2 eye teeth, larger than their fellows, showed under his lean lips like fangs. His eyes were yellow and muddy, as though nature had run short on pigments and squeezed together the dregs of all her tubes. It was the same with his hair, sparse and irregular of growth, muddy yellow and dirty yellow, rising on his head and sprouting out of his face in unexpected tufts and bunches, in appearance like clumped and wind-blown grain. In short, Beauty Smith was a monstrosity, and the blame of it lay elsewhere. He was not responsible. The clay of him had been so molded in the making. He did the cooking for the other men in the fort, the dishwashing and the drudgery. They did not despise him. Rather did they tolerate him in a broad human way, as one tolerates any creature evilly treated in the making. Also, they feared him. His cowardly rages made them dread a shot in the back or poison in their coffee. But somebody had to do the cooking, and whatever else his shortcomings, Beauty Smith could cook. This was the man that looked at White Fang, delighted in his ferocious prowess, and desired to possess him. He made overtures to White Fang from the first. White Fang began by ignoring him. Later on, when the overtures became more insistent, White Fang bristled and bared his teeth and backed away. He did not like the man. The feel of him was bad. He sensed the evil in him and feared the extended hand and the attempts at soft-spoken speech. Because of all this, he hated the man. With the simpler creatures, good and bad are things simply understood. The good stands for all things that bring easement and satisfaction and surcease from pain. Therefore, the good is liked. The bad stands for all things that are fraught with discomfort, menace, and hurt, and is hated accordingly. White Fang's feel of Beauty Smith was bad. From the man's distorted body and twisted mind, in occult ways like mists rising from malarial marshes, came emanations of the unhealth within. Not by reasoning, not by the 5 senses alone, but by other and remoter and uncharted senses, came the feeling to White Fang that the man was ominous with evil, pregnant with hurtfulness, and therefore a thing bad and wisely to be hated. White Fang was in Grey Beaver's camp when Beauty Smith first visited it. At the faint sound of his distant feet before he came in sight, White Fang knew who was coming and began to bristle. He had been lying down in an abandon of comfort, but he arose quickly, and as the man arrived, slid away in true wolf fashion to the edge of the camp. He did not know what they said, but he could see the man and Grey Beaver talking together. Once the man pointed at him, and White Fang snarled back, as though the hand were just descending upon him instead of being, as it was, 50 feet away. The man laughed at this, and White Fang slunk away to the sheltering woods, his head turned to observe as he glided softly over the ground. Grey Beaver refused to sell the dog. He had grown rich with his trading and stood in need of nothing. Besides, White Fang was a valuable animal, the strongest sled dog he had ever owned, and the best leader. Furthermore, there was no dog like him on the Mackenzie nor the Yukon. He could fight. He killed other dogs as easily as men killed mosquitoes. Beauty Smith's eyes lighted up at this, and he licked his thin lips with an eager tongue. No, White Fang was not for sale at any price. But Beauty Smith knew the way of Indians. He visited Grey Beaver's camp often, and hidden under his coat was always a black bottle or so. One of the potencies of whiskey is the breeding of thirst. Grey Beaver got the thirst. His fevered membranes and burnt stomach began to clamor for more and more of the scorching fluid, while his brain, thrust all awry by the unwanted stimulant, permitted him to go any length to obtain it. The money he had received for his furs and mittens and moccasins began to go. It went faster and faster, and the shorter his money sack grew, the shorter grew his temper. In the end, his money and goods and temper were all gone. Nothing remained to him but his thirst, a prodigious possession in itself that grew more prodigious with every sober breath he drew. Then it was that Beauty Smith had to talk with him again about the sale of White Fang. But this time, the price offered was in bottles, not dollars, and Grey Beaver's ears were more eager to hear. "You catch 'em, dog, you take 'em, all right," was his last word. The bottles were delivered. But after 2 days, "You catch 'em, dog," were Beauty Smith's words to Grey Beaver. White Fang slunk into camp one evening and dropped down with a sigh of content. The dreaded god was not there. For days his manifestations of desire to lay hands on him had been growing more insistent, and during that time White Fang had been compelled to avoid the camp. He did not know what evil was threatened by those insistent hands. He knew only that they did threaten evil of some sort, and that it was best for him to keep out of their reach. But scarcely had he laid down when Grey Beaver staggered over to him and tied a leather thong around his neck. He sat down beside White Fang, holding the end of the thong in his hand. In the other he held a bottle, which from time to time was inverted above his head to accompaniment of gurgling noises. An hour of this passed, when the vibrations of feet in contact with the ground foreran the one who approached. White Fang heard it first, and he was bristling with recognition while Grey Beaver still nodded stupidly. White Fang tried to draw the thong softly out of his master's hand, but the relaxed fingers closed tightly, and Grey Beaver roused himself. Beauty Smith strode into camp and stood over White Fang. He snarled softly up at the thing of fear, watching keenly the deportment of the hands. One hand extended outward and began to descend upon his head. His soft snarl grew tense and harsh. The hand continued slowly to descend, while he crouched beneath it, eyeing it malignantly, his snarl growing shorter and shorter as, with quickening breath, it approached its culmination. Suddenly he snapped, striking with his fangs like a snake. The hand was jerked back, and the teeth came together emptily with a sharp click. Beauty Smith was frightened and angry. Grey Beaver clouted White Fang alongside the head, so that he cowered down close to the earth in respectful obedience. White Fang's suspicious eyes followed every movement. He saw Beauty Smith go away and return with a stout club. Then the end of the thong was given over to him by Grey Beaver. Beauty Smith started to walk away. The thong grew taut. White Fang resisted it. Grey Beaver clouted him right and left to make him get up and follow. He obeyed, but with a rush, hurling himself upon the stranger who was dragging him away. Beauty Smith did not jump away. He had been waiting for this. He swung the club smartly, stopping the rush midway and smashing White Fang down upon the ground. Grey Beaver laughed and nodded approval. Beauty Smith tightened the thong again, and White Fang crawled limply and dizzily to his feet. He did not rush a second time. One smash from the club was sufficient to convince him that the god knew how to handle it, and he was too wise to fight the inevitable. So he followed morosely at Beauty Smith's heels, his tail between his legs, yet snarling softly under his breath. But Beauty Smith kept a wary eye on him, and the club was held always ready to strike. At the fort, Beauty Smith left him securely tied and went in to bed. White Fang waited an hour, then he applied his teeth to the thong, and in the space of 10 seconds was free. He had wasted no time with his teeth. There had been no useless gnawing. The thong was cut across diagonally, almost as clean as though done by a knife. White Fang looked up at the fort, at the same time bristling and growling. Then he turned and trotted back to Grey Beaver's camp. He owed no allegiance to the strange and terrible god. He had given himself to Grey Beaver, and to Grey Beaver he considered he still belonged. But what had occurred before was repeated, with a difference. Grey Beaver again made him fast with a thong, and in the morning turned him over to Beauty Smith. And here was where the difference came in. Beauty Smith gave him a beating. Tied securely, White Fang could only rage futilely and endure the punishment. Club and whip were both used upon him, and he experienced the worst beating he had ever received in his life. Even the big beating given him in puppyhood by Grey Beaver was mild compared with this. Beauty Smith enjoyed the task. He delighted in it. He gloated over his victim, and his eyes flamed dully as he swung the whip or club and listened to White Fang's cries of pain, and to his helpless bellows and snarls, for Beauty Smith was cruel in the way that cowards were cruel, cringing and sniveling himself before the blows or angry speech of a man. He revenged himself in turn upon creatures weaker than he. All life likes power, and Beauty Smith was no exception. Denied the expression of power amongst his own kind, he fell back upon the lesser creatures, and there vindicated the life that was in him. But Beauty Smith had not created himself, and no blame was to be attached to him. He had come into the world with a twisted body and a brute intelligence. This had constituted the clay of him, and it had not been kindly molded by the world. White Fang knew why he was being beaten. When Grey Beaver tied the thong around his neck and passed the end of the thong into Beauty Smith's keeping, White Fang knew that it was his god's will for him to go with Beauty Smith. And when Beauty Smith left him tied outside the fort, he knew that it was Beauty Smith's will that he should remain there. Therefore, he had disobeyed the will of both the gods and earned the consequent punishment. He had seen dogs change owners in the past, and he had seen the runaways beaten as he was being beaten. He was wise, and yet in the nature of him there were forces greater than wisdom. One of these was fidelity. He did not love Grey Beaver, yet, even in the face of his will and his anger, he was faithful to him. He could not help it. This faithfulness was a quality of the clay that composed him. It was the quality that was peculiarly the possession of his kind, the quality that set apart his species from all other species, the quality that had enabled the wolf and the wild dog to come in from the open and be the companions of man. After the beating, White Fang was dragged back to the fort, but this time Beauty Smith left him tied with a stick. One does not give up a god easily, and so with White Fang. Grey Beaver was his own particular god, and in spite of Grey Beaver's will, White Fang still clung to him and would not give him up. Grey Beaver had betrayed and forsaken him, but that had no effect upon him. Not for nothing had he surrendered himself body and soul to Grey Beaver. There had been no reservation on White Fang's part, and the bond was not to be broken easily. So, in the night when the men in the fort were asleep, White Fang applied his teeth to the stick that held him. The wood was seasoned and dry, and it was tied so closely to his neck that he could scarcely get his teeth to it. It was only by the severest muscular exertion and neck arching that he succeeded in getting the wood between his teeth. And barely between his teeth at all, at that. And it was only by the exercise of an immense patience, extending through many hours, that he succeeded in gnawing through the stick. This was something that dogs were not supposed to do. It was unprecedented, but White Fang did it, trotting away from the fort in the early morning, with the end of the stick hanging to his neck. He was wise. But he had been merely wise. But had he been merely wise, he would not have gone back to Grey Beaver, who had already twice betrayed him. But there was his faithfulness, and he went back to be betrayed yet a third time. Again he yielded to the tying of a thong around his neck by Grey Beaver, and again Beauty Smith came to claim him, and this time he was beaten more severely than before. Grey Beaver looked on stolidly while the man wielded the whip. He gave no protection. It was no longer his dog. When the beating was over, White Fang was sick. A soft Southland dog would have died under it, but not he. His school of life had been sterner, and he was himself of sterner stuff. He had great vitality. His clutch on life was too strong, but he was very sick. At first he was unable to drag himself along, and Beauty Smith had to wait half an hour on him. And then, blind and reeling, he followed at Beauty Smith's heels back to the fort. But now he was tied with a chain that defied his teeth, and he strove in vain by lunging to draw the staple from under the timber into which it was driven. After a few days sober and bankrupt, Grey Beaver departed up the Porcupine on his long journey to the Mackenzie. White Fang remained on the Yukon, the property of a man more than half mad and all brute. But what is a dog to know in its consciousness of madness? To White Fang, Beauty Smith was veritable, if terrible, God. He was a mad god at best, but White Fang knew nothing of madness. He knew only that he must submit to the will of this new master, obey his every whim and fancy. Ooh, Beauty is something else. Terrible man. An evil man. Manipulated through alcohol. Grey Beaver just did whatever it took for him to get that dog. Nothing good will come of this. And one of them is probably foreshadowing, probably not going to make it out of this relationship. My money is on White Fang surviving. He's a survivor. He's a tough cookie. My money's on White Fang. Anyway, we are between chapters, so as a reminder, hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, curl up with a blanket. I'm reading this book. We're going to do one more chapter today, and then we'll wrap up and find somebody lovely to go visit. Who's out there right now? Hold on. Just kind of curious, kind of get an idea of what's out there. The lovely bunch of coconuts, diddly-dee, there they all standing in a row, 2, 3, 4. There's a number. Ooh, Tiger Fae. Ooh, Tiger Fae is playing Viewfinder. That would be a good place to go. If Tiger is still, if they are still playing when we wrap up after this next chapter, we'll go visit Tiger Fae. It's been a minute since we've dove in to say hi. And Viewfinder is an amazing game too. I think If you haven't checked it out, it would be really cool. All right, let's get started here. Quick hydration break. Mm-hmm. Gotta tell you, having a 32 ounce, right? Yeah, 32-ounce bottle of water, like readily available right next to me whenever I'm streaming, 10 out of 10. Absolutely, absolutely banger to get things going. So, we continue now that White Fang has gone into the hands of Beauty Smith, and we'll see what terrible deeds this man will wreak upon this dog. Wolf dog? Wolf? Canine. We'll just, yes, canine. All right, so let's see where this next chapter goes. Chapter 3 of Jack London's White Fang, The Reign of Hate. This doesn't look good for White Fang. Under the tutelage of the mad god, White Fang became a fiend. He was kept chained in a pen at the rear of the fort, and here Beauty Smith teased and irritated and drove him wild with petty torments. The man early discovered White Fang's susceptibility to laughter, and made it a point after painfully tricking him to laugh at him. This laughter was uproarious and scornful, and at the same time the god pointed his finger derisively at White Fang at such times reason fled from White Fang, and in his transports of rage he was even more mad than Beauty Smith. Yes, things have indeed gone downhill since the chapter of bondage. Yes. Formerly, White Fang had been merely the enemy of his kind, withal a ferocious enemy. He now became the enemy of all things, and more ferocious than ever. To such an extent was he tormented that he hated blindly and without the faintest spark of reason. He hated the chain that bound him, the men who peered in at him through the slats of the pen, the dogs that accompanied the men and that snarled malignantly at him in his helplessness. He hated the very wood of the pen that confined him, and at first, last, and most of all, he hated Beauty Smith. But Beauty Smith had a purpose in all that he did to White Fang. One day, a number of men gathered about the pen. Beauty Smith entered, club in hand, and took the chain from off White Fang's neck. When his master had gone out, White Fang turned loose and tore around the pen, trying to get at the men outside. He was magnificently terrible. Fully 5 feet in length, and standing 2½ feet at the shoulder, he far outweighed a wolf of corresponding size. From his mother he had inherited the heavier proportions of the dog, so that he weighed, without any fat and without an ounce of superfluous flesh, over 90 pounds. It was all muscle, bone, and sinew, fighting flesh in the finest condition. The door of the pen was being opened again. White Fang paused. Something unusual was happening. He waited. The door was opened wider. Then a huge dog was thrust inside, and the door was slammed shut behind him. White Fang had never seen such a dog. It was a mastiff. But the size and fierce aspect of the intruder did not deter him. Here was something, not wood nor iron, upon which to wreak his hate. He leaped in with a flash of fangs that ripped down the side of the mastiff's neck. The mastiff shook his head, growled hoarsely, and plunged at White Fang. But White Fang was here, there, and everywhere, always evading and eluding, and always leaping in and slashing with his fangs, and leaping out again in time to escape punishment. The men outside shouted and applauded, while Beauty Smith, in an ecstasy of delight, gloated over the ripping and mangling performed by White Fang. There was no hope for the mastiff from the first. He was too ponderous and slow. In the end, while Beauty Smith beat White Fang back with a club, the mastiff was dragged out by its owner. Then there was a payment of bets, and money clinked in Beauty Smith's hand. White Fang came to look forward eagerly to the gathering of men around his pen. It meant a fight, and this was the only way that was now vouchsafed him of expressing the life that was in him. Tormented, incited to hate, he was kept a prisoner so that there was no way of satisfying that hate except at the times his master saw fit to put another dog against him. Beauty Smith had estimated his powers well, for he was invariably the victor. One day, 3 dogs were turned in upon him in succession. Another day, a full-grown wolf, fresh caught from the wild, was shoved in through the door of the pen, and on still another day, 2 dogs were set against him at the same time. This was his severest fight, and although in the end he killed them both, he was himself half killed in doing it. In the fall of the year, when the first snows were falling and mush ice was running in the river, Beauty Smith took passage for himself and White Fang on a steamboat bound up the Yukon to Dawson. White Fang had now achieved a reputation in the land as the Fighting Wolf. He was known far and wide, and the cage in which he was kept on the steamboat's deck was usually surrounded by curious men. He raged and snarled at them, or lay quietly and studied them with cold hatred. Why should he not hate them? He never asked himself the question. He knew only hate and lost himself in the passion of it. Life had become a hell to him. He had not been made for the close confinement wild beasts endure at the hands of men, and yet it was in precisely this way that he was treated. Men stared at him, poked sticks between the bars to make him snarl, and then laughed at him. They were his environment, these men, and they were molding the clay of him into a more ferocious thing than had been intended by nature. Nevertheless, nature had given him plasticity. There we go. Nature had given him plasticity. Oh my goodness. Where many another animal would have died or had its spirit broken, he adjusted himself and lived, and at no expense of the spirit. Possibly, Beauty Smith, arch-fiend and tormentor, was capable of breaking White Fang's spirit, but as yet there was no sign of his succeeding. If Beauty Smith had in him a devil, White Fang had another, and the two of them raged against each other unceasingly. In the days before, White Fang had had the wisdom to cower down and submit to a man with a club in his hand, but this wisdom now left him. The mere sight of Beauty Smith was sufficient to send him into transports of fury, and when they came to close quarters and he had been beaten back by the club, he went on growling and snarling and showing his fangs. The last growl could never be extracted from him. No matter how terribly he was beaten, he had always another growl, and when Beauty Smith gave up and withdrew, the defiant growl followed after him. Or White Fang sprang at the bars of the cage, bellowing his hatred. When the steamboat arrived at Dawson, White Fang went ashore, but he still lived a public life in a cage surrounded by curious men. He was exhibited as the Fighting Wolf, and men paid 50 cents in gold dust to see him. He was given no rest. Did he lie down to sleep, he was stirred up by a sharp stick, so that the audience might get its money's worth. In order to make the exhibition interesting, he was kept in a rage most of the time, but worse than all this was the atmosphere in which he lived. He was regarded as the most fearful of wild beasts, and this was borne into him through the bars of the cage. Every word, every cautious action on the part of the men impressed upon him his own terrible ferocity. It was so much added fuel to the flame of his fierceness. There could be but one result, and that was that his ferocity fed upon itself and increased. It was another instance of the plasticity of his clay, of his capacity for being molded by by the pressure of environment. In addition to being exhibited, he was a professional fighting animal. At irregular intervals, whenever a fight could be arranged, he was taken out of his cage and led off into the woods a few miles from town. Usually this occurred at night, so as to avoid interference from the mounted police of the territory. After a few hours of waiting, when daylight had come, the audience and the dog with which he was to fight arrived. In this manner it came about that he fought all sizes and breeds of dogs. It was a savage land, and the men were savage, and the fights were usually to the death. Since White Fang continued to fight, it is obvious that it was the other dogs that died. He never knew defeat. His early training, when he fought with Lip Lip and the whole puppy pack, stood him in good stead. There was the tenacity with which he clung to the earth. No dog could make him lose his footing. This was the favorite trick of the wolf breeds, to rush in upon him, either directly or with an unexpected swerve in the hope of striking his shoulder and in overthrowing him. Mackenzie hounds, Eskimo and Labrador dogs, Huskies and Malamutes all tried it on him, and all failed. He was never known to lose his footing. Men told this to one another and looked each time to see it happen, but White Fang always disappointed them. Then there was his lightning quickness. It gave him a tremendous advantage over his antagonist. No matter what their fighting experience, they had never encountered a dog that moved so swiftly as he. Also to be reckoned with was the immediateness of his attack. The average dog was accustomed to the preliminaries of snarling and bristling and growling, and the average dog was knocked off his feet and finished before he had begun to fight or recovered from his surprise. So often did this happen that it became the custom to hold White Fang until the other dog went through the preliminaries, was good and ready, and even made the first attack. But greatest of all, the advantages in White Fang's favor was his experience. He knew more about fighting than did any of the dogs that faced him. He had fought more fights, knew how to meet more tricks and methods, and had more tricks himself, while his own method was scarcely to be improved upon. At this time, as the time went by, he had fewer and fewer fights. Men despaired of matching him with an equal, and Beauty Smith was compelled to pit wolves against him. These were trapped by the natives for the purpose, and a fight between White Fang and a wolf was always sure to draw a crowd. Once a full-grown female lynx was secured, and this time White Fang fought for his life. Her quickness matched his, her ferocity equaled his, while he fought with his fangs alone and she fought with her sharp-clawed feet as well. But after the lynx, all fighting ceased for White Fang. There were no more animals with which to fight. At least, there was none considered worthy of fighting with him. So he remained an exhibition until spring, when one Tim Keenan, a faro dealer, arrived in the land. With him came the first bulldog that had ever entered the Klondike. That is, dog and White Fang should come together was inevitable, and for a week the anticipated fight was the mainspring of conversation in certain quarters of the town. My goodness. Well, so clearly White Fang has outmatched all dogs, wolves, and even a lynx in his power and ferocity at the hands of Beauty Smith. Just breaks my heart. I would like to end on a happier note, so that's why I think it would be nice to go visit my dear friend Tiger Faye, because I think a nice, calming, visual game like Viewfinder will be a nice way to end this evening. So all of you wonderful listeners that are here listening to this very brutal, raw story of this wolf dog and his journey into madness and ferocity. Thank you. We'll go ahead and end it here for today. Let's go visit Tiger Faye. And hang on for a moment while we go on a quick raid. Let's see. Find dear Tiger Faye. Okay. All aboard the choo-choo train. Oh yeah, I need to come up with a raid message. We have left the library. Something something raid. There we go. There we go. Okay. All right. My very first innocuous raid message. So be sure to copy that. That's good for everyone. That's a follower emote. So let's go visit Dear Tiger Faye. All right, all aboard. Let's go say hi.